And how do I,
And we're recording.
and we're recording. Great. So we need to, okay, we're ready to
Right.
start.
Should I go to this also? Or let you talk first?
You let me-
Then I'll open that after you talk.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Those of you online, hello out there. And to our live audience, welcome to this afternoon's lecture. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Carol Bacos, the director of the Center for a Study of Religion. Before I have the privilege and honor of introducing our speaker today, I do want to, while I have your attention, call your attention to our upcoming event on Thursday at 4 p.m. Same place, same channel, but a different lecturer. Professor Adele Yarbrough Collins, the current president of the Society of Biblical Literature, will be here. She will speak on Paul and ethics, ethics in Paul. So please join us on Thursday. I'll turn to today. Ethan Katz is Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where he has taught since the fall of 2018. And where he is also the co-founder and faculty director of the Berkeley Anti-Semitism Education Initiative. He is a specialist in the history of France and its empire in modern Jewish history. His book, The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, was published with Harvard University Press in 2015. And was awarded a number of prizes, many prestigious prizes indeed, including the J. Russell Major Prize of the American Historical Association, the David Pickney Prize of the Society for French Historical Studies, and a National Jewish Book Award. In 2018, it was translated into French. The French edition was the basis for a major exhibition that appeared in 2022 at Paris's National Museum of Immigration History. Professor Katz has also authored or co-authored more than 15 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters and co-edited 4 volumes. These include Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times, Colonialism and the Jews, and most recently, When Jews Argue, Between the University and the Beit Midrash. And this will be out with Routledge Press this fall. This most recent volume examines the relationship between Jewish studies, scholarship, and the academy, and traditional Jewish study and practice. And personally, I cannot wait to get my hands on this volume. Fascinating topic. Professor Katz is drawing on research from that book for his presentation today. So great, we'll get a preview. Professor Katz is at work on a new monograph currently entitled Freeing the Empire, the Alliance of Jews and Anti-Semites that helped win World War II. Which tells the story of the Algiers underground and its pivotal role in the success of Operation Torch. His research has been supported by a number of fellowships, including from the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, the Lady Davis Trust of the Hebrew University, Vidal Sassoon International Center for Study of Anti-Semitism, the Yad HaNadiv Bracha Foundation, and during the current academic year, the Social Science Matrix at Berkeley. It is truly our pleasure and honor to have Professor Katz with us today. So I'll turn things over to Professor Katz.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Carol. I'm afraid it's all downhill from here. So I'm going to share my screen here. No, I did the opposite of that. Let's try that again. Seems like it should be. I need to unpause that. Looks so easy. Sorry?
Share.
I think stop share, reshare, stop share. Then. Oh, I'm sorry, folks. We're gonna get there. Let's try that. There we go.
Chat.
We're gonna do that. It's gonna. Good. Do this. I'm gonna work on that. I'll get rid of. Yes, thank you. Okay. Thank you very much to Carol Bacchus for inviting me to UCLA. Thank you to Beth Kramer for all of your work on the logistical arrangements. Pleasure to be here. It's always nice to be here and see old friends and new friends. And I want to welcome and thank everyone who's tuned in from near and far on the live stream. Before I really get started, let me say a little bit about how I came to this topic, which is, as many of you are aware, quite disparate geographically and thematically from most of the things that I've worked on in my scholarship to date. Briefly, this is part of a larger project that Carol just mentioned, a book currently in production that centers on trying to think about Jewish studies, knowledge, and methods between the world of the Beit Midrash, or the traditional Jewish study house, and the university where academic Jewish studies resides. That project and this case study emerged from a year of study during my sabbatical in Israel in 2016 to 2017, where I took a weekly class with Alicia Ancelovitz, who is a scholar of Jewish law and himself a noted rabbi. And he taught in that class 1 week the rabbinic responsa, on which I'm going to focus in this lecture today. And soon after that, we started to collaborate on a deeper analysis of these texts as sources of both law and history, not knowing what an intellectual odyssey was ahead of us. So what I'm going to share is substantially the fruits of a years-long joint undertaking between Alicia and myself. And one of our major goals has been to answer a question posed more than 40 years ago by Chaim Soloveitchik: can halachic texts talk history? Today, I'm going to give an answer in 4 parts. First, I will describe the case as Alicia and I learned about it and discuss the questions that it raises. Then I will place the case in a series of larger historical contexts: religious, human, and material. Third, with all these contexts in mind, I will explain our decoding of the rabbinic texts and the fundamental questions that they raise. And finally, I'll examine briefly a set of literary encounters that illuminate the wider zeitgeist of which these rabbinic writings formed only one part. So part 1, the case and the long, as we call it, of the rabbis. In 1965, a seemingly stunning rabbinic discussion arose in Europe around the young men of a small Jewish community of the SubCarpathian city of Munkacz. Like many of their peers in Europe, a number of young men in that community had been born to mothers who, after surviving the Holocaust, had, quote, remarried in the belief that their first husbands had been murdered by the Nazis. That quote comes from the rabbinic texts that we'll be talking about. In the case of these young men, however, the original husbands of their mothers had subsequently returned alive. In the midst of that emotional and communal messiness, the mothers stayed married to their second husbands, their new husband, the son's fathers. The sons grew up, and now 20 years later, a rabbinic discussion transpired between 2 leading poskim, or Orthodox decisors of Jewish law. The issue was that since the sons of an adulterous wife are halakhically classified as Mamzerim, I'll say more about what this means in a moment, they were forbidden to marry fellow Jews. The rabbi asked whether these young men might solve the problem through a workaround outlined in the Talmud, whereby they could acquire Gentile women for wives as semi-converted slave women. Now, in the state where this issue appeared, then Soviet Ukraine, actual slavery was, of course, outlawed, and ownership of a person was completely non-existent under state law. Nonetheless, this halachic option, if it were still halachically valid despite modern legal prohibitions, would allow these young men to subsequently free each of their children into a full and new Jewish status, untainted by descent from adulterously conceived fathers. And so Rabbi Tzvi Elimelech Kalish of Munkacz turned to 2 leading rabbinic authorities to ask whether this halachic option was still valid. Trying to go to the next slide, but it is not letting me. Sorry. There we go. I think that's right. Okay. One of the rabbinic authorities, Rabbi Mordechai Yaakov Breish, responded that these young men should be allowed to marry and acquire slave women and then free their children into a full Jewish status untainted by an adulterous lineage. Against him, Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss responded that the secular law of non-slavery raised doubt about the halachic validity of such acquisition and of the Jewishness of the young men's children. He argued that these women also needed, therefore, to undergo a full conversion to Orthodox Judaism after being acquired as slave women. Only then could they be viewed halachically as slave women rather than as Gentile women with whom marriage is forbidden. As slave women, their subsequent children could be considered slaves who can be freed into a full and untainted Jewish status rather than Gentile offspring who remain forbidden to Jews. Now, you may imagine, when Alicia and I first encountered this case, our initial reaction was simply astonishment. How could it be the case, we wondered, that while fellow Jews were rebuilding Jewish life in Europe under the most dire conditions, these rabbis appeared so divorced from those efforts? How could they wallow in religious legal questions and categories that were disconnected from European Jewry's real-life challenges? After all, the war in the Shoah had already had a devastating impact upon the children who survived. Roughly 13 million European children had seen one or both of their parents die in the most devastating conflict in recorded human history. According to a 1946 estimate of the newly created United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, staggering numbers of children were homeless, 8 million in Germany alone, including both citizens and refugees, 6.5 million in the USSR, and 1.3 million in France. Children's languages, nationalities, and religious beliefs have frequently been decimated or transformed in the course of the war. Some young children had no memory of their parents. Moreover, many children have disappeared and remained unaccounted for. Between 1945 and 1958, the German Red Cross alone was flooded by more than 300,000 requests to trace missing children. From 1945 to 1956, the new International Tracing Service registered 343,057 such requests. Among Jews, furthermore, even fewer children survived. The Nazis had murdered most Jews too young to work. In Hungary, where Munkacz sat before and during the war, the Nazis had killed about 77% of Jews under the age of 20. In fact, as we know well from the work of scholars like Tara Zara, the war and the Holocaust had been so devastating that newborn children became the metaphor and means for reconstruction for Jewish and many non-Jewish communities across Europe. According to a widely disseminated discourse, Hitler and the Nazis, in the words of one declaration of the UN, had waged, quote, war against children. Further, quote, against their security in the family, against their education and general welfare, against their very lives, the fascists directed a deliberate campaign of destruction that has nothing to do with the incidental. As the European director of the American Joint Distribution Committee, or the Joint, Dr. Joseph Schwartz wrote to his board in 1947, quote, children have become a kind of religion here, a symbol of the continuity of a people. And yet Rabbis Kalish, Breish, and Weiss worried about some technical category of halakha. Furthermore, those who had survived faced myriad obstacles to normal life. Among aid workers, state officials, and psychiatrists, the figure of the, quote, lost children was constantly invoked, and the formulation of, quote, the best interests of the child became ubiquitous. Venita A. Lewis, a social worker for the International Refugee Organization in Germany, declared in 1948, quote, the lost identity of individual children is the social problem of the day on the continent of Europe. In many instances, Jewish organizations worked assiduously in order to place Jewish children in families, educational settings, or collectivities where their strong Jewish identity might be assured. Such efforts range from the formation of kibbutzim in Eastern Europe that plan to move to Palestine, to the formation of Jewish children's homes, to custody disputes over children hidden during the war by Catholic families. So the question persists, if persons who had emerged from such scarred backgrounds were now the young adults of 1965 European Jewry, was there really a need to be wary about a young Jewish woman marrying some young Jewish man from a stable family merely because his father and his mother had married, not knowing that the mother's original husband was still alive? This brings us to the purpose of our project. It would be easy to view the debates between Rabbis Breish and Weiss as highly technical arguments about legal formalism, as almost semantic word games or attempts to manipulate abstract categories of law to fit a given situation. Indeed, we often tend to regard halachic discussion this way. My colleague Alicia has pioneered a very different approach to rabbinics, which sees halakha through most of its history as a kind of practical wisdom, a commonsensical approach that entails drawing upon a tradition in order to apprehend and solve real-world problems. We can only understand halacha in this way. We can only decode these responses, as it were, if we realize that for rabbis Kalish, Breish, and Weiss, the primary language of serious discussion was traditional rabbinic. In a way that is difficult to recognize today, but that had been true on a wide scale for centuries, these rabbis were heirs to a tradition where they were trusted by fellow traditional Jews for real-life advice and day-to-day guidance. Even as these persons spoke in rabbinic language, they ultimately discussed real-life concerns. To repeat, such persons did more than base their lives on received customs and traditions. They were not focused only on semantic and conceptual analysis of written law texts, but rather believed they were transmitting a tradition of substantive wisdom learned from elders through experience in tight-knit communities over many generations. This case from Munkacz is about both the post-Holocaust survival and reconstruction of Jewish life and the survival of a Jewish langue that has become increasingly lost since the Holocaust. With the term langue, we mean a language with all the cultural and habitual features that are implicitly understood by its users. In our case from Munkacz, a modern reader, a person whose primary language of discourse about daily life is not rabbinics, can understand the detailed arguments of Rabbi Weiss and Rabbi Breish only by translating the arguments in parallel to the efforts and statements of better-known post-war actors oriented for the human needs and problems of Jewish survivors and refugees. In order to understand the langue in which these rabbis spoke, we should begin by clarifying their words and who they were. So first, the term mamzer in halakha. The word does not mean, contrary to a widespread misconception, forgive me, a bastard, simply a child born out of wedlock. Such a case is rarely considered a mamzer. Rather, a mamzer is a descendant of a very problematic union, and most typically a union where one parent's conduct is associated with outlandish sexual promiscuity. The status was one intended to create social isolation and to prevent members of the community from marrying into visibly problematic families. For the child to be categorized as a mamzer, the problematic union has to be in the open and known to the community. Being classified as a mamzer bars one from marrying a Jew, and the status, that of a kind of outcast, stays with you and your family for 10 generations. For this reason, the rabbis tried hard to find solutions to prevent someone from becoming a mamzer or passing along this status wherever they could. And this is how we arrive at the above-mentioned solution offered in the Talmud by Rabbi Tarfon in Tractate Kiddushin, wherein the mamzer can marry a semi-convert Gentile slave woman, and then their children will be categorized as slaves and can be, quote, freed into Judaism. Now, who were these rabbis? Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss was culturally not a Westerner. He was part of the Galician Jewish tradition that dominated the region around Munkacz, more specifically of the Hasidic tradition that spanned Eastern Galicia and SubCarpathian. To be even more precise, Weiss's Galician father, Yosef Yehuda Weiss, had been a follower of the Eastern Galician Belz Hasidut. During the First World War, the father had moved the family to Munkacz, where he joined the small Belz Hasidic community and served for a period as its, quote, Dayan Umoed Tzedek, righteous judge and teacher. And Rabbi Yitzchak Yaakov Weiss later followed his father's footsteps when he left years of study in Munkacz to become the Dayan Umoed Tzedek of a different Eastern Galician Hasidic-dominated community, that of Grossvardain, which is now Ordea, Romania. Similarly, Rabbi Mordechai Yaakov Breish was culturally not a Westerner. He had also been born in Galicia, had been raised as a chassid of the Belzer Rebbe, had served the Galician congregation of Duisburg in Germany, and had, after the rise of the Nazis, served the independent ultra-Orthodox Eastern European community of Zurich. In short, both Rabbi Weiss and Rabbi Breish were Galician ultra-Orthodox Jews. They felt at home in the norms and values of the Eastern European variation of traditional Judaism, and they felt at home in its langue, and they shared a common culture and langue to such an extent that Rabbi Weiss's only childless son and one of Rabbi Breich's daughters had married each other by the time that these two rabbis found themselves discussing the question of the young men of Munkacz. They were, to use the Yiddish phrase, machatunums. There's even a reference to them discussing this case while on vacation. When I shared this with one of my students, they said, wow, they really knew how to relax on vacation. The response of Rabbi Weiss and Rabbi Breish accordingly provide a window onto an overlooked tributary in the river of post-Holocaust Jewish survival and reconstruction. The responses themselves are markers of the post-Holocaust survival by specific rabbinic Jewish langue, and most importantly, the responses provide an overlooked window onto an overwhelmingly displaced Jewish tradition of speaking. Part 2, the setting, historical Munkacz before, during, and after World War II. Now, we need to step away from these chubot for a moment to see the historical realities of the social and cultural setting to which they spoke. In the immediate post-war moment, nowhere was massive displacement or the challenge of transmitting Judaism to the next generation more pronounced than across the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, including in the borderlands of Transcarpathia, where the town of Munkacz, or Munkacheva, resides. Transcarpathia, also rendered Subcarpathian Rus or Ruthenia, is set in the Pannonian Basin, nestled at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. Much of the region is surrounded by rivers, the Tisza to the east and south, and the Hornat and Poprad in the west. Sovereign rule over the region had shifted repeatedly. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Transcarpathia was part of the Kingdom of Hungary within the Habsburg Empire. During the interwar years, it became part of Czechoslovakia until it was taken back by the now independent Hungary on the eve of World War II. At this time, it was bordered to the south by northern Transylvania, to the west by Slovakia, and to the north and east by Nazi Germany. The interwar Jewish community in Munkacz was one of extraordinary vibrancy. It was here that a young Yitzhak Yaakov Weiss had grown up, received his training, and first taught in yeshiva. Jews formed as much as 43% of the town's overall population. There were 14% of the population across Transcarpathia as a whole. The community's considerable welfare and educational institutions included its own hospital system, an active Chevra Kadisha, a Maccabi Youth Athletic Association, an old age home, a publishing house, and thriving local Jewish press, a Hebrew gymnasium known to Jews across Czechoslovakia, and a rising diverse scene of Zionist activity. The Munkacz yeshiva, run by the town's rabbi Chaim Elazar Shapira, was a leading center for Torah learning in Transcarpathia, enrolling 280 students as of 1939. The town featured multiple Hasidic courts, most notably those of the Shapira or Munkaczer Hasidim, the Belz Hasidim, and the Spinka Hasidim. Rosh Shapira was widely respected for his Torah learning, but opposed by many due to his politics, tactics, and the corruption that in time occurred under his leadership. Struggles between Rav Shapira and other forces within the Jewish community became ubiquitous and intense. The Rav was substantially successful, however. Whatever inroads Zionists, communists, and other secularists made in the 1920s and 1930s, on the whole, most of Munkacz's Jews maintained a more traditional outlook and lifestyle. This remarkable community would be utterly destroyed by the Shoah. During the period from the Hungarian repossession of Transcarpathia in late 1938 to the spring of 1944, the far-right Hungarian regime imposed increasing anti-Semitic restrictions that shuttered or impoverished numerous Jewish institutions, drove Zionist activity underground, and left large segments of the community in poverty. Large numbers of Jewish men in Munkacz were drafted into the labor forces of the Hungarian army. During the summer and fall of 1941, in a brief wave, several hundred Jews from the area were deported. By March 1944, the Germans occupied Hungary. In May of the same year, the Nazis deported 29,000 Jews from the Munkacz ghetto on my train. Most of them would never return. The chaotic nature of the summer of 1945, particularly in this borderlands region, makes it difficult to estimate the overall numbers of survivors. Among the 15 to 20,000 survivors of the Shoah in the region, some 2,000 were from Munkacz. Although contemporary estimates varied widely, it's clear that many fewer Jews returned to Munkacz than had left. Roughly 85% of the town's Jewish population perished. Many who returned did not stay for long. By June of 1945, the formerly Hungarian Munkacz, which had been occupied by the Red Army in the fall of 1944, became Munkacz in the Soviet Ukraine province of Transcarpathia. Thus, as one survivor of Auschwitz reported, out of 1,100 returnees native to Munkacz, only 600 stayed after the Soviet takeover. By April 1946, a report from the Joint said that while the town initially had as many as 10,000 Jews right after the war ended, now there were only 100 Jewish families that remained. By July 1945, moreover, those women returning to Munkacz who still awaited their husband had good reason to presume him dead. Many of the women and men who were returnees to Munkacz had passed through Budapest, checking daily the bulletin board of the Great Synagogue and looking through long lists of names for those of their relatives. They had also checked newspapers, appeared at the offices of international agencies, posted notes in community centers, listened for rumors of their loved ones, and gone each day to the train station hoping for a sign of life. By midsummer 1945, furthermore, 3 successive waves of returnees had arrived back in Munkacz. First, in early 1945, were those who had been conscripted into the Soviet army as labor servicemen. Then in March, the deportees freed from the camps of Eastern and Central Poland. Some returned from Budapest thereafter once the Allies pushed the Germans out of Hungary. And the final wave, just liberated by American or British forces, came in June of 1945. With the last group, therefore, even the many who returned to Munkacz specifically in search of relatives and were willing to wait a while would have reasonably inferred that anyone who had neither returned nor made contact was almost surely dead. If the presumption of death was not always accurate, some women remarried only to be shocked later when their first husbands reappeared. Presumably, these first husbands included men who reappeared very late. After all, 10 million displaced persons across Europe sought to return to their homes in the spring of summer of 1945, and the majority came from Eastern Europe. Nearly 1 million refugees were still in Germany 1 year after the Allied liberation. Almost all of them were East Europeans who refused or were unable to board repatriation trains. Moreover, unknown numbers of prisoners of war and refugees were being retained by the Soviet Union in labor camps. Rabbi Tzvi Munkacz of Munkacz reported that the first husbands who returned to Munkacz after their wives had remarried included men who reappeared in one of the initial waves of refugees, only to find that their wives had actually remarried even before July of 1945. Rabbi Kalish had also returned to Munkacz after surviving Auschwitz, and he would return there again from Siberia following Stalin's death in 1953. Rabbi Kalish was someone who viewed life in a nuanced manner. We can see this, for example, in a teaching where he said that a person must recognize and accept the truths that exist even within false assertions and ideologies. Nonetheless, he wrote from Munkacz in 1965 that in the immediate aftermath of destruction, quote, newlywed young men had not checked properly and had married whatever woman they chose. And in those days, immediately in the first months after liberation, there was no leader in the city that could awaken them to the danger. Even as Rabbi Kalish recognized that the women who had returned had, quote, gathered together from exile in Germany and were, quote, far away from their husbands, he described the speed with which many remarried as heedless. Although it might seem contradictory to display both compassion and judgment toward these women, such an outlook was hardly unusual. We'll see from rabbinic and broader historical sources that both Jews and Gentiles recognized that a nuanced approach to life called upon society to address, rather than deny, the real-life messiness of men returning to discover wives who had not waited for them and had married anew. And I just want to clarify that there's a specific context of halachic discussion in this moment that the rabbi is partly responding to. That is, there was a recognition among many Orthodox rabbis in Europe right after the war that they had a crisis on their hands in terms of the fact that there are very high requirements technically for someone's spouse to be recognized as dead, and that they are therefore permitted to remarry. And so there were specific bettins, rabbinic courts that were convened for the purposes of dealing with this crisis and creating authorizations based on some amount of evidence for women to remarry. So part of what Rabbi Kalish is critical of is that these young men and young women did not seek out a betin. He says there was no leader in the town also, he acknowledges that. And so they did not go through a process which would have put them in a much stronger position in terms of Jewish law in the event that the spouse surprisingly returned. These men and women of Munkacz who remarried without consulting with experts were part of a much larger story. Across Europe, the war and genocide had been particularly devastating for many women. I'm just going to acknowledge that I'm about to share some fairly disturbing facts and descriptions, and I apologize if they're harder to hear. So staggering numbers of rapes and sexual assaults had occurred in the course of the war, in the camps of the Shoah, at the hands of Allied armies during the liberation, and the subsequent occupations. In her book about the immediate post-war period, Jews, Germans, and Allies, historian Atina Grossman sums it up well. She says, women survivors carried with them memories of rape and sexual violation, not only by Germans, local fascists, and Soviet liberators, but also in forced encampments, ghettos, and hiding, where women were subject to sexual coercion by partisans, rescuers, and fellow victims. Many had endured the sheer bodily terror and humiliation imposed by Nazi roundups and concentration camp processing, when they were ordered to undress or their pubic hair was shaved along with the hair on their head. Women especially had buried within them complicated, uncommunicable stories about prostitution and rape, about instrumental sex, or even about genuine love affairs, and all the gray zone situations in which sex functioned as a crucial currency of survival. Because of these experiences, and precisely because, quote, after liberation, when chaos reigned, all women were considered fair game by Soviet liberators, close quote, the experience of liberation and the prospect of future heterosexual relations may have been profoundly different for women and men. Nonetheless, both women and men survivors overwhelmingly did not speak about these types of events. Just as shame quickly shelved men's discussions of Holocaust memories of degradation, women stayed silent about having been raped, despite both men and women survivors knowing that women and girls had been raped, and even as a 1944 special task force of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, or UNRWA, recognized the need of refugee women and girls for sexually safe spaces. Numerous women in the wake of such experiences sought out children in marriage. The years after the war witnessed an astonishing baby boom in the DP camps. By late 1946, a survey of the Joint showed 750 babies born each month in only the official DP camps of the US zone in Germany. According to the same study, quote, nearly 1/3 of the Jewish women in the zone between 18 and 45 were either expectant mothers or had newborn babies. There were 8,000 Jewish infants under a year old after there had been hardly any under 5 at the start of the year. Joint observers noted a, quote, unprecedented rise in the Jewish birth rate, and they attributed this to, quote, the overwhelming desire of Jewish DPs, most of them sole survivors of destroyed families as a result of Nazi persecutions and horror, to propagate and perpetuate their kin. Even as birth rates slowed a bit by 1948, as it became more likely that Jews would emigrate either to the new state of Israel or the US, the annual birth rate remained greater than that of the United States, Sweden, or Switzerland. And these countries were all experiencing their own post-war baby booms. And the birth rate was far higher than the pre-war Eastern European Jewish birth rate. Now, Tina Grossman has argued compellingly that this reflects a life-affirming instinct born of having endured the mass murder and terrible persecution of the Shoah. Of course, given women's frequently precarious economic situation, affirming life could also mean finding an urgently needed breadwinner. Some women vocalized quite explicitly the urge to reproduce. Many women had not had their period for months or even years and feared that they had lost the capacity to have children, making them eager to marry and see if such a thing might still be possible after all. Indeed, for a host of reasons, many women would marry soon after the war's end. As we'll now see, already during and immediately following the war, leading halachic authorities recognized and even validated this human need. At the same time, however, they recognized another human need. They recognized the survivor's emotional need to regain and even rebuild whatever aspects of their former lives they could. This need was expressed both communally and personally. This need was expressed personally by finding survivor hometown acquaintances, relatives, sometimes even cousins, and rarely even siblings. More relevant for our focus, this need was also expressed personally by finding that one's husband was alive and had waited for her, or that one's wife was alive and had waited for him. Given the devastation around Munkacz, it's unsurprising that this region too felt the impact of broader patterns of massive displacement, including an observable rush to marry and bear children. The trickle of refugees awaiting word of loved ones in distant lands was felt in the atmosphere of the post-war Jewish community. Numerous new and growing Jewish families had been established among the survivors of the region. As of 1948, many of these families had between 3 and 5 children. Likewise, the destruction and trauma of the war catalyzed a quest for new beginnings in the form of rapid marriages. Numerous women interviewed by anthropologist Anya Quilich spoke about weddings in the years following the war as widespread, small, hastily convened, and concerned as much with starting a viable new life as with finding a love match. Although Rabbi Kalish described the speed with which many remarried as heedless, Kalish also recognized, and was cited by Rabbi Weiss as recognizing, that the women who had returned, again, I'll remind us, had, quote, gathered together from exile in Germany, that they were, quote, far away from their husbands, and that they had no rabbinic leader in the city to awaken them to the problem of remarrying quickly. He recognized that these unions occurred, quote, on account of the chaos from the movement of families in scattered lands, close quote. Similarly, Rabbi Breish, in another response from 1944 about the paternity of an orphan girl, recognized that, quote, the terrible destruction, close quote, had led to the phenomenon of traditionally educated and observant youth whose paternity was unknown. He thus pointed out that one must avoid being too concerned about such questions when those youth reach the age of marriage. So we finally return in part 3 now, decoding the responsa, to one of our opening questions. Why were the sons of women who had married quickly and whose original husbands happened to turn out to be alive considered Mamzerim? After all, the same rabbis who categorized them this way sympathized with the reasons that had led to the less than ideal sexual unions. So first of all, they did not entirely treat these young men actually as Mamzerim. They were trying to enable them to marry a free convert who would merely be designated as a, quote, slave woman, and thereby sire children who would not be considered Mamzerim. Since there was no slavery, this was hardly the same thing as Rabbi Tarfon's lobby of the Mamzer humbling himself by foregoing a wife and heir to his line by marrying a slave woman and then beginning a new familial identity by freeing the children into Judaism. In this case, the woman would be his full wife and the children would be fully his. Thus, Rabbis Weiss and Breish are saying something nuanced here. On the one hand, they were not concerned about these young men or any of these men's children expressing, quote, Mamzer-like negative behaviors. That's why they validated any children that these men might sire through a free convert wife who was merely designated, quote, a slave. On the other hand, they were not willing to forego this designation. They still forbade marriage between these men and Jewish women and even required that free convert wives be designated slaves. Where the two rabbis disagreed was over whether a slave woman must fully convert to a punctilious observance of halachic Judaism in order for her to be recognized as a slave woman, or whether she might merely reject idolatry and loosely accept Judaism. As regards the viability of a Gentile woman becoming a, quote, slave woman, even by merely rejecting idolatry and loosely accepting Judaism, Rabbi Breish ruled that that suffices. He disputed whether or not the principle of dina de machuta dina, or the law of the land is the law, should apply in this case, and thereby questioned whether or not it was relevant that in Ukraine actual legal slavery was prohibited. Moreover, he insisted that even if one did not accept the idea that this Gentile woman was halachically a slave, it would still be better for the Mamzer to marry her than to marry another Gentile, quote, who has not immersed and accepted the Jewish commandments, close quote. Rabbi Weiss disagreed and took a different approach. In what he called a coverall Engels solution, he argued that a slave woman must fully convert to a strict observance of halachic Judaism in order for her to be recognized either as a slave woman, if such a designation is valid, or as a genuine convert to Judaism if it is not. Now, if we read these rabbis technically, neither of these solutions is actually altogether coherent. In Rabbi Breish's case, if the slave status of the woman is not accepted, she will be considered like any other Gentile. In terms of formalistic categories, what would be better about marrying her then, as he argues, would remain the case. In Rabbi Weiss's case, if the slave status is not valid and she is instead a convert, the children will remain Mamzerim. So that solution, in formal technical terms, hardly, quote, covers all bases. Both rabbis appear at this level to make weak arguments. But if we dig deeper and see them as substantive arguments, then their logic and the underlying issues come into focus. First, Rabbi Weiss pointed out his concern that in a society without actual slavery, where slave status is a, quote, legal fiction, the husband will have no means to bind these women who have not fully committed to Judaism to carry on Jewish lives. Thus, just as intermarriage is forbidden, so is this form of intermarriage. And Rabbi Tarfon would indeed not have permitted intermarriage. Therefore, the woman must fully accept all religious obligations in order for the mamzer to be allowed to partner with her. Secondly, once a full conversion is done, however, rabbinic society could still choose to view the wife as a, quote, slave woman and to view the children as, quote, slaves who are freed into a new familial identity. Breish, by contrast, argued that a mamzer should not be required to find the most pious convert, a woman who's also committed enough halakha to undergo a full conversion. Breish argued that the conversion status of semi-Jews is one that Jewish society had granted in the past. In fact, slaves were semi-Jews. So just as Rabbi Tarfon had recognized that some Jewish men might sometimes be allowed exceptionally to live with semi-Jews, this lesser conversion can suffice for the Munkacz Mamzerim, who would choose to marry a Gentile woman if they could not find a Jewish spouse. As Rabbi Breish stated, even if you weren't fully convinced that they could be designated as slaves, having these men marry such Jewish identifying women was better than having them marry outright Gentile women. So we can see from this that really Rabbi Breish and Rabbi Weiss did nothing more than discuss and debate straightforwardly in rabbinic vocabulary whether it would be a good idea or a bad idea to allow mamzer men to marry women who are not full converts. And that enables us to return to our opening argument. Why did Rabbi Breish and Rabbi Weiss even care to view the sons of the unfortunate wives whose original husbands returned as mamzerim? Or to question this from the opposite end. If they truly were concerned about the potential problematic qualities of these sons, how did having these sons marry fictional slaves erase the concern about the next generation? So we should recall that the 10 Mamzerim from Munkacz embodied the collapse of the traditional Jewish family structure, norms, and values at the hand of the Nazis and their collaborators. Rav Kalish's account described the marriages that produced these offspring as, quote, impure unions. Here were children whose families had been irrevocably upended and stained due to the Nazis. Their fathers and mothers had made decisions in the wake of the Shoah that were comprehensible in their time, but ultimately proved disastrously ill-advised. With both the rabbinic perspective and the context of post-war Europe in mind, we can now see that Rabbis Weiss and Breish described the sons as mamzerim, but actually viewed the sons as merely somewhat mamzerim, or we might say mamzer-ish. And why they never felt the need to spell out this nuance. On the one hand, Rabbis Weiss and Breish strove to rebuild Jewish life, traditional Jewish life with its parameters of ethics and piety, meaning they did not merely seek to increase the number of people who self-identified as Jews. Rather, they sought to rebuild Jewry as they had lived it and as they understood it, as did a number of other secular and religious Jewish leaders and organizations in the post-war years. Thus, they had sought right after the Holocaust to convince men and women to wait for their spouses or to verify their spouses' deaths. And thus they felt a need in 1965 to send a message against women and men marrying without a woman having been divorced from her first husband. They understood the behavior of these women and men who had married quickly, but they were still kind of horrified by it. Moreover, the fact that these women and men had inappropriately stayed married worsened the situation. Thus, Rabbi Weiss and Rabbi Breish forbade these sons from freely marrying into the community like there was nothing wrong with their parents' behavior. On the other hand, they simply sought to rebuild Jewish life in any possible form. Likewise, the rabbis understood that wives and husbands who survived the Holocaust did not have stable communities in which they could idealistically await their lost spouse. Moreover, they had suffered severe trauma, death, destruction, and often even rape that called forth a basic human response to rebuild. Thus, as Rabbi Weiss and Rabbi Breisch acknowledged, the behavior of the women who remarried before verifying that their husbands were dead was understandable. It was not a sign of a potentially dangerous character. Thus, it was only necessary to name the sons Mamzerim, quote unquote, rather than to treat them as actual Mamzerim. In other words, when Rabbi Breisch and Rabbi Weiss used the term Mamzer, they slipped into the vocabulary of their native langue to describe the phenomenon before them that they actually saw as more like Mamzerish. In the nature of people who speak about real-life matters in their native tongue, Rabbis Weiss and Breisch casually stretched the semantic range of the word that most appropriately described what they were seeing and doing. There's a classic Mamzer and there's a post-Holocaust Mamzer. Both types are real-life concerns rather than technical concerns. Both also fit in the same semantic range. Fundamentally, Breisch and Weiss were acknowledging that these Mamzerim had become in their own way among Europe's millions of, quote, lost children. Typically, those defined with this label had lost parents in the war or the Holocaust or been hidden or exiled in faraway lands. Such children's future security, home, and identity were matters of considerable doubt and contestation. Yet these Mamzerim, even if their parentage, religion, and place of residence were clear enough, were in their own way lost. They were children of parents who were looked askance at by at least a portion of the community because of the choice to marry while an original husband proved to still be alive. Moreover, the specter of the lost child and the potency of children as symbols of reconstruction, community, and family heightened the stakes of breaking the, quote, cycle of the generations. Weiss and Breisch were offering in their own langue a debate that concerned in part, quote, the best interests of the child, a phrase and concept that became as ubiquitous as it was malleable among aid workers, state officials, and psychiatrists in the post-war. Pushing into another realm, we come to part 4, literary encounters. We have found striking intertextualities with fiction and historical essays published at the very same moment as the Tshuvot of Breisch and Weiss that also treat the issue of what happened when presumably deceased spouses of survivors suddenly reappeared. In my remaining time, I will touch on 2 examples. The first is a historical essay entitled The Position of Hungarian Jewry After the Liberation, published by Ilana Benešovsky, who was the longtime head of the Jewish Museum of Budapest, and published in 1966. Just about the same time, in a short-lived annual called Hungarian Jewish Studies. Benešovsky was not only the longtime head of the Jewish Museum of Budapest, her brother was also the chief rabbi of Hungary, put all this together, the timing, and the essay carries sort of eerie echoes of Breisch and Weiss's debate. And at first glance, it reads like a refutation of many of the rabbi's assumptions. This is a reminder that one could think sympathetically about the choices facing the survivors who returned in more than one way, and in more than one langue. Indeed, Benešovsky writes in the langue of the empiricism of the social scientists. In its brisk 22 pages, the author lingers at remarkable length over the fate of post-Holocaust survivors waiting for their loved ones. Remember, this is an essay all about, broadly speaking, the position of Hungarian Jewry after liberation. And she first broaches the topic early in a melancholy passage that reads, quote, the survivors lie on the straw bedding of transient homes and in the crowded rooms of emergency hospitals, and except for the daily reading of the list of the returnees and looking for their lost relatives and fighting for the little food, nothing interests them. They are totally paralyzed. Beyond the minimum necessities, they have no desires whatsoever, and this is the most tragic trait of the psychological picture of the survivors. The language used here, with not only its sadness, but also its implicit judgment about failure of the returnees to move forward, is all the more striking when compared to the author's tone several pages later, in a section under the subheading, The Era of Regeneration. There she writes, quote, the individual had to take stock of his losses, had to struggle with his burning memories, and then could find his place anew and establish a new life for himself. This formulation begins to defend survivors who awaited missing spouses for the seriousness and emotion with which they approached the issue. Underlining the point, she recounts further how, quote, the great majority of the survivors of fascist persecutions first had to realize that what they had feared was real, that the members of their families were not alive. Acknowledging the difficulty in establishing hard data, Benešovsky notes that, quote, in the provinces, there was hardly any family in which both the husband and the wife survived. By implication, this means that a woman whose husband had not returned in a town like Munkacz had every right, simply based on the overwhelming statistical reality, to assume at a certain point that he was dead. Picking up the thread of her earlier narrative about what choices people made in the aftermath of such a realization, Benešovsky thus continues, quote, "The first weeks and months were spent waiting and searching for the deportees. But when it became obvious that those whom they waited for would no longer return, the individuals, while they could not and perhaps would never be able to stop mourning for the loved ones, nevertheless wanted to normalize their circumstances. Those who had been left single married again. Jewish children were again born in Hungary, and in surprisingly large numbers." Set alongside the case of the 10 Mamzerim, Benešovsky's essay reads like a defense of the mothers. It is a defense that emerges from this scholar's own authentic effort at commonsensical, practical approach, concerned like our rabbis with the realities of life. These women did not quickly forget their husbands, she suggests. Instead, they waited for them each day for a long period. Then they mourned their presumably murdered spouses with tremendous sadness. But at a certain point, rather than find themselves deadened and incapable of moving forward, these women decided to marry. Before long, they did the crucial work of having children, vital not only for their own psychological well-being, but for the rebirth of the Jewish community. To underscore that this Jewish rebirth was on substantially traditional terms, Benešovsky proceeds in the next paragraph to highlight with precise statistics the historically low rate of intermarriage among Jews in Budapest in 1946, and the massive increase in marriage and birth rates among Jews of the countryside versus those of the interwar years. Benešovsky seems to say that by all measurements, these women were acting not only appropriately, but virtuously. Here then was a narrative that also engaged with the torturous challenges of the post-war, the terrible destruction faced by the returnees, the uncertainty and dread concerning their loved ones, the desperate need to reconstruct family and community. Benešovsky assessed the women's choices and behavior in a different long and with different conclusions, but as part of a common conversation about common challenges. Likewise, the second example, Isaac Bashevis Singer's novel, Enemies, a Love Story. First published in serial form in Yiddish in the foreword, again, also in 1966, this gives a more intimate portrait of how its characters approach the same issues. The novel centers on the dilemmas of Herman Broder, a Holocaust survivor living on Coney Island a few years after the end of the war. Broder has good reason to believe that his first wife, Tamara, along with their children, were murdered in the Shoah. He is remarried to Jadwiga, the non-Jewish Polish former servant girl to his family who saved his life during the war, and he has a mistress, Masha, who is a fellow survivor. Suddenly, Herman reads in the newspaper that he should call a Rabbi Abraham Nissen, and he hears stunning news. Their conversation reads like a secret window into the interior of so many moments in the post-war world wherein the living found their lives suddenly invaded by the dead. "I have information about Tamara. She's alive." Herman said nothing for a long time. He heard himself saying, "How can this be? A witness saw her being shot. What was his name? I can't think of it. Yes, it's true she was shot, but she remained alive. She escaped to a friendly Gentile's house. Later, she made her way to Russia." "Tamara alive," Herman said the words out loud. This hysterical woman who had tormented him and whom he had been about to divorce when the war broke out had risen from the dead. He wanted to laugh. His metaphysical joker had played him a fatal trick. Singer's novel thus gives us a different, more intimate portrait of what happens when a spouse presumed to have died in the Shoah returns. Even as the case is reversed, since it is the wife rather than the husband who rises from the dead, many of the issues treated are quite similar. Singer and his characters speak in the tragic comic long of Jewish fiction, and yet the long of halakha lurks here beneath the surface as well, and is illuminated by reading a novel alongside the Tshuvot of Rabbis Breish and Weiss. While Singer had left the cradle of tradition decades before, his father had been a dayan, and he wrote at length about growing up at the feet of his father's halachic rulings. He knew well many of the nuances of the religious work. Read with these rabbinic sources in mind, one conspicuous aspect of the Singer novel is its sometimes quasi-halachic language concerning what Broder believed about the fate of Tamara. On no fewer than 4 occasions, we hear that Herman heard from, quote, an eyewitness who, quote, saw her being shot. This is a fundamental element of being able to rule that one's spouse is dead and one is authorized to remarry. Moreover, in the author's note at the outset, Singer locates the origins of novels like this in his life over many years living among refugees of the Shoah, and how, quote, if the book's characters fit into the general picture, it is because the exception is rooted in the rule. Rabbi Nissen, uncle of Herman's first wife, Tamara, also voices his halachic perspectives repeatedly on the protagonist's situation of multiple wives. When he learns about it at the reunion meeting between Herman and Tamara, he reassures Herman that he's not committed any transgressions by remarrying, noting that the famous prohibition on polygamy by Rabbeinu Gershom does not apply to him. Nonetheless, he takes the parallel position to Rabbi Weiss regarding assumed loyalty to the original spouse. Quote, one thing is definite, you'll have to divorce your present wife. At the same time, a bit further on in the conversation, he takes a different tone that carries no expectations regarding upstanding halachic conduct, on the part of those who face such situations. Quote, "This is a time of moral chaos. The guilty ones are the wicked murderers. Do not take the blame on yourself. There wasn't a choice." Even as Hermann refuses to leave Jadwiga, the rabbi maintains a degree of sympathy for him. His words illustrate well that rabbis could find multiple ways to show empathy for those who had made ill-fated decisions to remarry in the wake of the Shoah. Why, asks Nissin, should these young people be expected to have faith when he himself was plagued by doubts? How could those who had lived through the destruction believe in the Almighty and in his mercy? Deep in his heart, Rabbi Abraham Nissin had no sympathy for those Orthodox Jews who tried to pretend that the Holocaust in Europe had never taken place, close quote. The interconnections between Benešovsky's and Zinger's contemporaneous writings on the one hand, and the response of Breisch and Weiss on the other are highly suggestive. Read together, these works resonate differently than they do in isolation. We can see that each speaks its own langue, and that together they appear as pieces of a larger, little remarked zeitgeist of the early to mid-1960s, wherein the return of the dead of the war and the Shoah and all of the accompanying social, cultural, and indeed legal consequences was on the minds of many. So to conclude, to return to the question, can halakhic texts talk history? Alicia and I have concluded that yes, they can, and they often do, but not necessarily in the way that we expect. In the analysis of Weiss and Breisch that I've outlined, I've argued against the prevailing understanding of halakha. I've also sought to problematize Jewish historians' dismissive attitude toward the details of halakhic discussions, particularly in the modern era, as valuable sources for wider phenomena. More specifically, a burgeoning scholarship on post-war European Jewry has often focused on matters of community boundary and reconstruction, individual and collective memory, and women and children. Thus, it offers critical context for this halakhic debate, but it has rarely taken account of traditional rabbinic sources or questions. Doing so will not always yield happy results. Indeed, we may arrive at uncomfortable conclusions. In the end, it seems that neither Rabbi Breisch nor Rabbi Weiss was willing to make his views in the case we have studied halakhically binding. Each had significant reservations about if and how their approach could overcome what was ultimately the devastating impact of the Nazi assault on the Jewish family in the Holocaust. In this manner, we see that like aid workers, artists, state officials, refugees, migrants, survivors, novelists, and more, the rabbis of the generation that lived through the Shoah grappled mightily with the charred landscapes of Europe. For them too, the ghosts of the continent's murdered Jews were never far from sight, and the past could never be mastered in the present. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes.
By all means.
Are there questions out there?
It looks like there are some questions.
Stop sharing.
Okay, sure, of course. Oh, sorry, that's not what I did. Okay, now I gotta go find the questions down here. You have started transmitting. Okay, not sure what that means, but I.
Yes, there we go. The chat.
Okay. Scroll up here.
I have a technical question.
Hi, Micah.
Hi. So yeah, quick technical question. The Rabbi Tarfon workaround
Yes.
for the children to not be considered a mamzer.
Yes.
Does it apply to females also, or just to males?
I believe that it seems to be much less often an issue for women in the same way, right? So to go back to the fact that the rabbis, the easiest way to deal with a halakhic challenge like this is to find a way to pretend that it doesn't exist, that the thing didn't happen, right? So women in these situations were often able to or encouraged to relocate to a different community and raise their children there with a new spouse, right? Whereas for men, that was generally much less of an option. So I don't actually think that the rabbis address directly like how a mamzeret can, like they don't offer the solution for a mamzeret in a direct way.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Sure. That's the question.
You want to go down?
Yeah, let me see if I can scroll down here in the chat. I see some comments, but there's also a question.
Yeah.
Don't think that I'm being flippant, please, but there were several episodes of the sitcom Taxi where Carol Kane and Andy Kaufman have to resolve problems in their marriage involving infidelity, where they resort to arcane legal loopholes and old country traditions. Right. So I don't think you're being flippant. Don't worry. I have to confess, I've only seen very tiny excerpts from Taxi, so I can't speak to that specific situation. But what I would say is it would be interesting to go back, perhaps, to watch those and ask yourself whether or not they are simply arcane legal loopholes, right? Or whether there's actually something substantive that you could detect beneath the seemingly arcane legal language, as I tried to do in the analysis here. Happy to answer more questions.
From,
I think,
Paul.
Paula. Yes.
She can unmute.
Yes, go ahead, Paula.
Ethan, thank you for this fascinating talk, but I have a kind of basic question. It doesn't seem to me that these rabbinic answers address the particular problems that these women had who married a second husband, even though the first husband was still alive. So we have, which is how you initially framed the whole problem. So did they at any point address that particular matter?
Well, I mean, so first of all, there are other cases where they find a way to deny that the child is a mamzer, particularly depending on the timing of the pregnancy and if the woman decides to return to her first husband and they can claim that the child actually came from the first husband and that the marriage was invalid on halakhic grounds, right? So there are a number of cases like that. They're always trying to get around actually declaring someone to be in the status of a mamzer. So in these cases, you know, these women are in trouble, halakhically speaking, in significant part, as I said, because they didn't go to a bet din before they married, or remarried, I should say. So I think the way in which these rabbis do try to address, and I'm going to give another example that I had to cut from what was already too long to talk. I think that, you know, they acknowledge in their description of the case real complexity. They acknowledge that these women were facing difficult situations and they try to arrive at a solution that is far less punishing socially than, you know, certain people might expect, or if they were really treating them as mamzerim, you know, fully in a traditional sense. One of the reasons that I'm led to believe that these rabbis are more cognizant of women's dilemmas than we might think is there's a case. Take some time, so give me a minute to explain it. After the war, Rabbi Weiss is asked about women who were in the camps and whether or not they can remain married to a Kohen or whether they can marry a Kohen. The reason he's asked this question is that a woman who has been sexually violated is traditionally not eligible to be married to someone of the priestly caste. His response to that, which is counterintuitive, and I had to, you know, Alicia and I went through a lot of discussions about this. His response is to say, we know that the Nazis did not actually rape Jewish women in the camps. The race laws would not have allowed them to do that. Now, the initial response that I had, and that I think we might all have to that, is what a denial of these women's experiences of having been raped. But the reality was that there was, as I said in paper, tremendous shame attached to rape. And again, the easiest way to deal with these kinds of halachic problems is to deny they exist. Women didn't want to talk about being raped. Women didn't want to be in situations where they were not eligible any longer to their husbands. And so actually there was significant compassion in this response, even though when we think about our notions of feminism and agency, we bristle at the response initially. And this is from like 1946, right? So I do think that they're trying to take account. Obviously, they have limitations. Obviously, their answers are different, say, than, you know, Ilona Benishevsky's really ardent direct defense of these women. But what's also the case, Paula, is, ultimately these tshuvot that I focused on, they are a response to the problem of their offspring, right? I don't have tshuvot from say 1947 from someone in this specific community saying, what do we do now? The conclusion seems to have been widespread that these women had a problem, that their kids were considered Mamzerim. As I said, there were other cases where the rabbis felt they could get around the problem depending on the circumstances.
Thank you.
I saw a hand.
It may have been followed.
No, it's another one. Can you move the chat?
Sure, of course, sorry.
Yeah, I think Ava Lippman had her hand up, or maybe that was a
Okay,
mistake.
let me go to the next page here. See if anyone's there. Other questions or comments? Paula, I'm so glad that you watched because I thought about your research when I was working on this, so I really appreciate you tuning in. Questions in the room?
I just want to echo the comment about how fascinating this is. I mean, because when we think of halachic discourse, we don't appreciate the human element, which this talk really brings to life. I mean, even just this example, one shudders to think that that we would say no, it didn't happen, but for such a deeply sensitive reason, that
Right.
kind of reasoning. I mean, I guess maybe I'll just shift us to the present, and I'm curious, as you were working through this period and working through halachic issues, is there a present day analog to this that comes to mind for you? Is there any?
Right, so it's a great question. I mean, I think there definitely are, I have to think, I'm tired of contemporary examples. I mean, what I will say is, I think I said in the paper that in some ways we see this as part of what was kind of like a dying tradition in that moment. One of the biggest problems that Alicia identifies in the modern period in terms of the struggle to maintain this kind of rabbinic tradition is when, it's not just the modern period, starts in some places earlier, is when identity becomes the fundamental question for rabbinic decision-making. Whether it's, quote, very liberal or makel or very conservative or machmir, when it's about identity rather than about a practical solution to a concrete problem, then people are making a decision based on, kind of abstract ideas, abstract categories, rather than the situation in front of you. What I think is interesting is that you do sometimes see, quote, more conservative or more Haredi halachic authorities today who find what seem like more creative solutions that are more, regarded by some people as more liberal in certain situations than someone who identifies strongly as modern Orthodox. And sometimes they seem to be coming out of this tradition of like, they don't feel like they have to sort of make an identity presentation, and they're going to, figure out what is the practical challenge and what is a practical solution from the tradition. I'm going to try to think of a more concrete example.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And truly, thank you for this talk, and thank you to the audience.
Yes, thank you to everyone who tuned in and stuck with us.
That was really wonderful. Karen has a final.
Yeah, question. Here's a question. I'm aware of the Munkacz community and the Belzers, having been there because of the fights in World War I between the Shachtim of the Belzer Shachtim and the Munkacz Shachtim. So I'm curious, did any of the other You said there were two other Jewish communities, the Munkacz, Hasidim, and others. Did they have anything to say about this? After all, it was Munkacz, not Belz.
Well, right. The problem is those communities are basically destroyed by the Shoah, right? Rabbi Kalish is the kind of the only respected rabbinic authority still in Munkacz. I think already by the late 40s, certainly by 1965, right? You know, I didn't have time. So there, you know, Alicia and I have written a considerably longer article that digs deeper on most of these issues, and it'll be in this book that Carol mentioned, When Jews Argue Between the University and the Beit Midrash, that's coming out in October. And in there, you know, we talk about there's a dynastic crisis in Munkacz that arises already in the late 30s and early 40s. When Rav Shapira dies in 1937, he doesn't have male heirs. His son-in-law, who's known as Berkeley, becomes the chief rabbi of Munkacz. And while he's very learned, he's from Poland, he doesn't have local ties. The Dowager Rebbitzin, the widow of Rav Shapira, remains this very strong kind of domineering presence at the Hasidic court. This is a world in which there really are Hasidic courts. And so Berkeley kind of is struggling to establish his own authority. He is one of those several hundred who are deported from Munkacz in 41. He does return and he tries to persuade the community how serious the situation of the Shoah is, but he sets himself up in Budapest, which he already hoped to make his center. He then leaves in early 44, he writes a letter to the community, and not only does he leave, in great contradistinction to his deeply, deeply anti-Zionist father-in-law, he goes to Palestine. So the fact that he was no longer there when in May of 44, the ghetto was liquidated, and the fact that not only that, but he had gone to Palestine, whereas his father-in-law was this deep anti-Zionist who was revered by so much of the community, that means that when Rabbi Kalish says there was no rabbinic authority at the time of these unions, I read him to also be talking about a dynastic crisis, the absence of a kind of patriarch of the community. And so even though there were these three Hasidic sects before the war, Rav Shapira is this towering figure in the larger community. And that kind of vibrancy of multiple sects and all of the kind of competition over different Jewish streams in Munkacz is decimated by the war. So there's no presence for those Hasidim to have, you know, an opportunity to speak on this. It's a good question.
Did Reb Arla say anything out of Jerusalem? Reb Arla of Belz? Did Reb Arla of Belz say anything out of Jerusalem? Where he was? He'd also run away.
It's a great question. I don't know the answer to it, but I'm going to write it down. This is a very rarely mentioned case.
Got it.
You know, but doesn't mean that it's not there. It's a great question.
Wonderful. You have homework to do. Thank you for that, Karen.
Yes, thank you for that great question.
Yeah, and again, thanks to everyone, and big, huge thanks to our speaker, Professor Katz. Thank you.
For having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
What a pleasure. Did I end the Zoom?
It's stop recording.
Oh, stop the recording first.
There you go. That's.